Let's start here. Welcome to another episode of Scotch and Watch, where co-host Chris and I report on the collision of big tech and big media and call BS where it's needed. I'm an investigative reporter and the author of the Future Media newsletter on Substack, and Chris Duncan, here enjoying his cup of tea, is
Morning.
the former CEO of Global Mag Group Bauer in the UK and the former MD of the Times in London. We tackle serious subjects, although we do it with expertise and a bit of banter. Me from Sydney, where it's already the future and where I drink whiskey, hence the name Scotch and Watch. This won an award this very week, Australian whiskey, in one of the world's best whiskies. And with Chris, who's on coffee, as it's first thing in the morning where he is in London. So, Chris,
Morning,
good
there.
morning. Good morning, mate. How are you? How's your week?
Yeah, very good, thank you. Very good. Yeah, busy week.
What's happening in London?
I meant to tell you because you'll like this. Today is what they call a white drizzle in London, which is when
Beautiful.
it's slightly raining, but the clouds are white, which statistically is the best weather in Britain for newspaper sales.
Is that right? Is that
Yeah.
right? Because you're not going anywhere else. Is that right?
Exactly. It's wet enough that you want to sit in and read the paper, but not so wet you won't go outside. If you want the optimum weather for Sunday newspaper sales, it's a white drizzle. We've got it today.
And that's why no one wants to be a paper boy anymore. Is that,
exactly.
Is that the deal?
Yeah.
All right. So look, we're going to get right into the guts of Google this week. Okay. So Google decided this week, for those of us in the industry that were under a rock this week, it decided to throw petrol on a bushfire here by telling the world that it considers that the global news industry is worth nothing. Now, I've actually heard this before from another big tech company, which maybe we'll talk about a bit later on. But Chris, why don't you fill everybody in just to bring everybody up to speed with what this is all about? Because I know you've just written a piece on your Substack about it.
Yeah. So I got interested in this at the start of the week. It was released, I think, the end of last week. And the way that Google like to do it, which is sort of a nested press release. There was a big press release that said Google proves that news has no value whatsoever to Google. And then it referenced a study that had been run that said, oh, by the way, this is found because we found these numbers in this study. And so I'm always interested in, well, let's go and have a look at the numbers. Let's go and kind of see what we think the study was. And it's quite an extraordinary thing. So Google effectively, as you know, are in negotiations with the EU. The EU said, you have to kind of value news, and Google is trying to kind of reduce effectively the valuation. So it said it was going to run a random control test. And it selected 8 countries, which is with about 43% of the EU population in them. So Spain, Italy, Belgium, Denmark, Croatia, Greece, and another one. And not notably France or Germany, but it selected these 8 countries. And in those countries, it identified every EU source of news, which was just over 13,000 sources of news. And it said we're going to take 2 samples, a 1% sample that will be in the test and a 1% sample that we'll use as a control. And for one of those, we're going to effectively turn off access to all of that news. And we're going to run the study for until it looks statistically kind of complete, which turned out to be about 10 weeks, running from November to January. And we're going to measure across those 2 1% samples all ad revenue and daily active users. And we're going to see what the impact is on the kind of our revenue of turning off access for these citizens to news. Mm-hmm. So a few things in there just to add. One is to do that you have to be able to actually do this in your sort of your systems, which is pretty impressive. Secondly, you have to be able to measure daily active users and ad revenue at an individual level during that period of time, which if you think about all the different search products, this runs across not just search, but also Discover. It runs across news. It's running across even maps, places, shopping, the whole place.
Right? I just don't give a shit because I don't use any Google products anymore, but they all sound fascinating.
Yeah.
The 15 people that still use it.
The whole thing, right? Anyway, they run the study. It runs for about 10 weeks, and they produce then a lot of information that says, look, when we measure it, we basically see that we only lost about, I think it's 0.77% of daily active users. The ad revenue was basically pretty much the same. In fact, it was slightly up. And therefore, we can only conclude that there is no value makes no difference effectively for us if we stop serving news to those customers. It makes no difference to us. Therefore, EU, why would we overpay for something that has absolutely no monetary value to Google? And that was the conclusion that was put out in their press release. So there you go.
Thank you.
So the question has been answered, Ricky. There's no value at all.
Thank you. Thank you so much for re-triggering me in a week of being triggered. So look, this is kind of Groundhog Day for me. One of the great things about living in Australia is I already live in the future, right? So I'm already living a world that you're not in yet. It's going to take you hours to catch up with me. So I already know what happens in the future, right? Which means that I've already heard this idiot narrative before, okay? And I'm hoping there's Google people on the call because you can hear it from me personally, and let's make this personal. So the first thing is that when we had the News Media Bargaining Code, when the government here decided it wanted to make Google and Meta pay for news, Meta brought a scientist to a table, almost exactly like this Paul Liu guy that's written this one. I've tracked him down. Jeez, Louise. Right, okay, so terrific. I wonder how long he'd last in a normal high street. But anyway, look, he, Meta brought one of these people to a session, and they sat down and they said, we've done this massive research. We've got all these diagrams. It's all incredibly complicated. And basically what we've concluded is that news isn't worth anything. Yeah? It's funny that they both would have come to the same conclusion. But you see, it misses one thing. It misses the fact that even if it's 0.7% of Google's traffic, which I think it probably is, then that means that 0.7% of Google's traffic is an entire industry that employs tens of thousands of people and makes $100 billion contribution to the GDP of nations across the world. Now, if you wanted to be able to show perfectly an examination and a proof point of global monopoly, I can't imagine a better one. And so while Google's trying to defend itself in court and bring an appeal to say, hey, we're not a monopoly, by telling them that the entire news industry is worth 0.7% of their traffic, proves they're a monopoly. So I think that this is strategically a huge error. So that's the first thing I'd say. The second thing is that the only reason they're doing this, the only reason they've done this research, and the only reason they pulled this guy out into the light, poor guy, because he's going to be absolutely vilified, is that they're trying to prove that news doesn't matter. And the reason they're trying to prove news doesn't matter is that they don't want Europe to pass a law that creates a precedent that every other country in the world can follow. And that's exactly the same playbook that they played in Australia and that they played in Canada. And they're trying to do the same one again in Europe. Okay. So this is a playbook, right? It's really simple. Read page 13, right? This is exactly how the game is played. And so this is disingenuous because if you have a global perspective on this and you're able to call BS on what this is actually about, you can discover just what the real motivation is. And I think they're going to regret it. I really do.
Well, I think also, so I think we should look at, there's two ways to look at this for me. There's like the micro version, which is let's just walk through the study and just pick out like some of the things that mean from a contextual point of view, it's not exactly as it looks, right? So we should do that first. And then there's the macro bit, which is what you're talking about, which is even if the study were whole, could you then conclude what they're concluding? And I'm not sure you can. And I think there's a reason for just thinking that through, which we should do. So let's do the micro bits first. So you're measuring daily active users, right? Which means that if you as a user touch Google anywhere, and that means, we know that Google is 90% of the search market. We know that it's basically the default search engine on all mobile smartphones, pretty much. We know that it's, you're getting a DAU kind of daily active user count if you access a map, if you end up shopping, if you do all of the things that Google can do. So it's a pretty wide net. It's looking at all ad revenue. So across everything, it's search across every sector. So if you end up searching for a car, right, during this test, then the search ad revenue from that car search is counted in this revenue. So it's the widest kind of possible comparison. That's one thing. We know that customers weren't notified. So there is something psychologically, if I say to you, look, I've stopped providing the service that you expect, you seek an alternative provider. If I don't do that, you're much less likely to change your behavior because each day you just think there must be no news today, like they're kind of, or whatever. Secondly, they did not exclude so they excluded all EU providers, but that does not exclude anything from the UK, anything from the US, and any aggregator. So the biggest beneficiaries, they say themselves in the study, the biggest beneficiaries were Facebook, a Spanish aggregator site called InfoBay. It was YouTube. It was Pinterest. It was Wikipedia. So they're still effectively servicing the results of the search queries, just with other sources of news, right?
Mm-hmm.
Think about the timeline this is running. What happened, do you think, in the world between November and January that might have been newsworthy?
Oh, was that an election?
Yeah, which
Uh,
relentlessly and ruthlessly covered, as you know, by all US and UK, media outlets, all of which would have come up in any search in this period of time. So
yeah.
when they say that they effectively stop news, that's just not really the case, right? Particularly in this area. From a search and ad revenue perspective, the other thing that happened in here was Christmas. So this runs
Mm-hmm.
over Black Friday, it runs into Christmas, and it runs all the way through the shopping period. So you've got these kind of these factors in there.
Yeah.
And then go on.
Oh, I was just going to say we've just been joined on the call by the Riverine Grazier, that is the lead litigant in the $12 billion class action against Google. So welcome.
Morning to you.
Yeah, fantastic. I'm sure they'll have a view.
So that kind of says, look, okay. So when you put together all those numbers, I mean, I would argue they said, it proves that there's no value to news. I would say it proves that if you take away some news for some customers without telling them for a short period of time, the impact is less if you count it across everything, the whole wide environment, which is something, but it's not quite the thing that they're claiming.
Hmm.
That's the
Look,
micro bit.
I'm the macro bit. So,
Yeah, I know.
the first thing is that there's an experiment a few years ago. I tried to break my day down into what I did in 5-minute increments, and I was really, really religious about following it for quite a while. I wanted to kind of draw a DNA map of my behavior over the course of a day. How much time was I online? When was I seeing ads? When was I listening to the radio or music? When was I addressable for monetization? Was what I was trying to discover. And what I actually discovered was something else. I discovered that there were many things that I did that I didn't realize the true value of those things. So spending time with my family was more valuable. Spending time reading great art was more valuable. To me personally, okay? And so not everything has to be monetized with a CPM. And then the second thing is that if I was to think, okay, well, if I was to analyze my search traffic, which by the way isn't on Google, I haven't used a Google search tool for 2.5 years. Okay, if I was to analyze, what I'm finding real value in, is it in looking for a new car or trying to find a cheap way to park in the city? Or is it learning about the latest situation in the Ukraine or somewhere else? And so you can't value news by a CPM. It doesn't make sense, right? And we've been trying to monetize news like that for a long, long time. So when somebody like Google says, well, this doesn't meet our CPM calc, okay, no problem. Maybe that is just the reason that we as the news industry just need to say goodbye to Google and find other ways to distribute, right? Maybe this is just, maybe we have reached irreconcilable differences and it's time to have a divorce.
Well, there's an interesting point in that, which is, which I like making up just visual analogies, right? So this is my centipede fallacy.
Mate, you don't have to tell me this. I hear this from you all the time. Everybody else only gets to hear this for an hour. Like, go on.
So this is the thing. If you've got a centipede and it's got 100 legs, right, and it loses a leg, it can still walk. I'd get into that right. It can still walk, and that's fine. And so this is essentially the 1% test that we've run. We've taken a leg off the news and we've said, look, the centipede still walks the same. Nothing happened here. You take 100 legs off a centipede, right? You have a very, very, very still centipede. And so the question about value that you're getting to is, look, if there is a value exchange for customers with Google, which is completely not in this study. This is all about what we get in that relationship. If you think about notifying 100% of the customers in those 8 countries and saying, we Google, as an American-owned information provider, have decided that we will no longer support any local news in your jurisdiction, and we will only supply news from aggregators and from outside kind of other media companies. And that's the service that we're going to provide in these countries, and that will be permanent. It'll be ongoing, and we're going to tell that to the people that use Google. We're going to tell that to the governments in those countries, and we're going to tell it to advertisers in those countries. The assumption in this study is that that would be exactly the same as a secret 1% random control test, that the impact would be exactly the same.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that centipede can walk.
No. Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you.
I mean, you make the point, right, about this is actually, when you think about what they've done here, they've suppressed 13,000, did we say? 13,000
Yeah.
news organizations as part of this
Yeah.
test.
13,147. Yeah. So, look, I'm the macro guy. You're the micro guy. I'm the macro guy. We're learning this. One of the things that I did, so tons of people sent me this study when this was revealed about a week ago, right? And I've resisted writing about it all week because I don't always think that the best thing to do is to have a knee-jerk emotional reaction. I'd go away and reread. So of the 1.5 million words of evidence in the Google antitrust trials that I've covered, I went back and read them all. It took me days and days and days. But I wanted to pull out some of the things that just might possibly be the motivation for why Google's decided to release this study today or in the last couple of days. So the first thing to remember for those of you that haven't been following it this closely is that Google was prosecuted in an antitrust trial in America for an app store that charged effectively unfair fees, okay, to people. It fought the case with a jury, completely convinced that the jury would think that Google's just the greatest thing since sliced bread. There's no possibility ever that the jury would say that they were guilty. And the jury went for lunch, okay, and came back an hour and 47 minutes later, found them unanimously guilty. And that included the hour-long lunch break. So Google isn't as popular as Google thinks it is. And there was a real shock in the court. It was beautiful to watch. Then there was a second antitrust trial that claimed that it was a search monopoly. And we learned so much in that search monopoly case. We learned that Google had the dominant share of mobile, not because it had Android, but because it also paid backroom deals to Apple to own all of Apple's search traffic as well. And we also learned that, you know, behind the scenes and out of sight of both its advertisers, its customers, and its publishers, it hiked prices and what it called shook the cushions to fake, to basically increase their earnings to meet various Wall Street needs. And it just proved that this company could twiddle a dial out of sight of anybody in the world and add a couple of 100 million here and there, okay? And it was absolutely terrible. But probably the most important thing that I took away from that trial and that I think is now going to come back and really hurt them most of all is that as part of that trial, and think about what they've just done to newspapers, okay? And think about what's in their head when they decide to turn off news to half of Europe, right? Or half of, to be fair, they turned it off to 1% of people, but they turned off half of Europe's publishers, okay? To those 1%. Here's what they did. They got a bit of a track record for this because in the court case, at the end of the first trial, and I'm going to read for you off a screen I've got behind me exactly what was said. We learned that Google had been told by the judge to retain all communications, okay, in the 2-year run-up to the trial under what's known as an evidence hold. This is a common thing, right? We want to see what's actually going on within your company. You cannot delete this stuff, yeah? So Google's lawyer trained its executives and said to them, hey, you can send emails to each other if you like, but they're likely to end up in an antitrust trial. But it's entirely up to you. But if you would like to have your conversations in Google Chat, that's set to delete every 24 hours. Let's see what happens. And so all of this information disappeared. Now, at the end of the trial, I was actually in Cuba making a documentary about a story that I'd done. And my phone just lit up. I remember I told you about this a little while ago. My phone was just a ding, 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 ding. And what happened was that the judge in the first trial had stopped the trial and he said, and I'll read this to you. This is about the messages being deleted. He said, and I quote, "It's the most serious and disturbing evidence I have ever seen in my decade on the bench with respect to a party intentionally suppressing relevant evidence. This conduct is a frontal assault on the fair administration of justice. It undercuts due process. It calls into question just resolution of legal disputes. It's antithetical to our system. And I was like, wow, he means it. But then he went properly thermonuclear. He said, I'm going to get to the bottom of who is responsible. That is going to be separate and apart from anything that happens here. But that day is coming, he said. I was like,
Jeez.
Boom, let's have a bit of that. Now, I've covered a lot of court cases. Judges don't normally get emotional. That was a good one. So then they go to their second trial. They go to the trial over their search monopoly, okay? They lose that, okay? The judge in that case comes back to this and says, here we go, this is a second judge.
Yeah.
The court is taken aback by the lengths to which Google goes to avoid creating a paper trail for regulators and litigants. It's no wonder that this case has lacked the kind of nakedly anti-competitive communications seen in Microsoft and other cases. Google clearly took to heart the lessons. It trained its employees rather effectively not to create bad evidence. Ultimately, though, here he goes again, thermonuclear, it does not matter. Liability does not rise or fall on whether there is a smoking gun proof of anti-competitive intent, and any company that puts the onus on its employees to identify and preserve relevant evidence does so at its own peril. Now, if I was Google, I'd probably be thinking I may have slightly made a mistake in deciding to delete all this evidence. So then they go to their third trial, which we're still waiting the result on, right? But at the end of that trial, the judge in that one, who, by the way, Leona Brinkema, brought down the CIA, okay, she's not messing. She says, this is not the way in which a responsible corporate entity should function. It is a clear abuse of privilege. Okay. So Google is a twice over anti-competitive illegal monopoly. And today we're supposed to believe its assertions about news because it's done a survey. Why should we believe them on anything? I mean, this is a company that ignored a court's demand not to delete evidence and then deleted tens of millions of emails, including 90% of the CEOs. Sorry, they weren't emails, they were messages. 90% of the CEOs' messages. And they shook the pillows to fake data, hid the results, and we're supposed to think this is okay, and we're supposed to believe them, okay? So I have a real problem right now with this whole thing. But I'm not even done, because I'm only just really getting started on my rant here. We're only 23 minutes in, so I've got some more I want to say.
I loved a bit earlier when you said, by the way, that I was the emotional one.
Yeah, well, I've done my best to keep my emotions hidden here, right? But so anyway, they've done all of this, and no one's, like, even Google themselves accept that this has happened, okay? And so you remember the first judge? Let's go back to what he said. Where was it? He said, hang on, let me find his exact words again. I'm going to get to the bottom of who is responsible, and that's going to be separate and apart from anything else that happens here, but that day is coming. Yep. So here we go. We then wait 400 days of silence. Yep. And Google probably thinks it's got away with it. And then 37 US states drop a court case. And the court case basically says, you deliberately and in bad faith deleted all of this information, okay? And the states are after someone's head. Now, this is a different kind of prosecution. This isn't a antitrust trial or a competition trial. Yeah. This is a deletion of evidence to pervert the course of justice trial. That is a different matter entirely. So I'll read you verbatim part of what it says in the court case. Are you ready? It says here, Google's chat retention policies were deliberately created for the express intention of depriving enforcement authorities of the use of Google's employees' chats in litigation. I'm already worried, okay? I'd be worried.
Yeah.
The fact Google preserved emails by default, but not chats, which it pressured its employees to use, creates the strong inference that the policy was intentional and in bad faith. I'm worried about words like bad faith. I know you and I have both had lawyers.
You know what that
before.
means.
Words like bad faith, those ones are ones that don't go away. A party who destroys 90% of a category of evidence produced by an employee under a litigation hold intends to deprive its adversary of that evidence. Now I'm getting a bit shivery, okay? Google's remedial action in 2023 hammers the point home. Once its policy was uncovered, Google implemented a fix. That it did so swiftly after being caught red-handed, another word that would cause alarm, shows that its prior non-compliance was willful. There's another one. Severe sanctions are necessary not only to punish Google, but also to deter other civil litigants from engaging in similar conduct.
So if you pick out all the legal terminology in there, that's a pretty bad beating.
That's a bad beating. And that trial hasn't even started yet, right?
No.
So I think that while we can be distracted by Google's right hand over here, which is about trying to protect its earnings, trying not to set a legal precedent, trying not to let to try and bully publishers into not wanting governments to pass these laws over here. This is all the fight Google thinks it's in, because it's really, really, really worried about the fight it's really in, which is this one over here.
Yeah, and Matthew makes a great point in the chat, which is that the original mission was to organise the world's information. It became to monetize the world's information some time ago.
I might pinch that for the headline. That's quite good.
Yeah,
thanks, Matt.
It's definitely the case, and you're right. It's almost impossible. I think if you think about actually working within Google, the monopoly point. We're talking like. We're not talking sort of on the boundaries of 40 to 50% of the market. We're talking 95% on search in smartphones is coming their way. So it's very, very hard as an organization to kind of suppress that in all of the internal conversations and all of the everything that you're doing, because it's just a de facto monopoly. One of the great tests of a monopoly is, can you degrade your own product and see no impact on your revenue? And actually what they've done in this study has proven that. They've said that we took out,
totally agree.
We've effectively degraded, all provision of local news. And look, our ad revenue was exactly the same.
I know. It's so antithetical to their own argument to say, hey, we can turn this off. And even after we turn off the thing that people are looking for, it doesn't make any difference to our traffic. Just tells you it's a monopoly.
So it kind of feels to me like we're in the, it's not quite the end of Rome, but it's the bit, there's a bad Caesar. And we've kind of gone past the point where we're trying to establish that there was a monopoly, right? That now is just a fact, and it's not even disputed. It's not disputed by anybody.
No, right? Correct.
So for those of you that are kind of competition law wonks, as probably I would count myself as, there's no problem actually having a monopoly is not illegal, right? What's illegal is using your monopoly position to create market distortion and harms for everybody else. So I think we're in the period with Google where we're not really arguing anymore that there is a monopoly. What we're really arguing about is the valuation of the harms, and the kind of the level to which governments or the DOJ or whoever is willing to separate parts of Google to minimize harms. And that's a profoundly difficult place, I think, for an organization to operate in, while every quarter you have to turn up and write your kind of SEC filings and show how the business is doing better than it's ever done, because Google shareholders, do not want to hear that this is the end of Rome. And that's exactly the tension you see, right?
You're brilliantly right on that. And so I actually watched, as triggered as I was this week, Matt, who's on the call here, will tell you, is that I went away and watched a 6-part historical retelling on Netflix of the fall of Greece. Because the fall of empires is fascinating to me, and they're almost always the same shape. And this feels exactly like that. You're completely right. The other thing that's really interesting is that if you read, so Brad Smith is the chairman of Microsoft, and when he joined Microsoft, he joined as a lawyer to fight their antitrust action 25 years ago, and so he came into the company as a lawyer to defend them, and basically found a whole group of managers in the business. He's written a book about it. It's fascinating. And he basically, all of the managers from Bill Gates all the way through his execs were all just like, giving the finger to the authorities. And we're just like, look, we're Microsoft, right? What are you talking about? We're absolutely fine. And the lawyer was saying, Brad was saying, no, they're going to win. These are governments and laws, and you're not above them, okay? And it's not about whether or not Excel is awesome. It's about whether or not you're even allowed to have Excel in the future, right? And he basically tells a story about this six stage mourning period that leads to antitrust. And he says that the first, I'm not going to remember all of them, but the first one is these guys are stupid. They don't understand what we do, number one. Number two, there's absolutely no chance we're going to lose. Number three
Yeah.
is, oh shit, they're after all this evidence. They must really, really mean it. Number four is, oh my God, I've given them all that evidence. I think we might lose. Number five is, oh my God, we are losing. And number six, he says, is actually, do you know what? It's not so bad. We're fine. We can go back to innovating. And he said that you need to get to the sixth stage of mourning on antitrust as fast as you can. And he actually said that about Google. He actually encouraged them to get to six. And I think they're in all five. They're going through all five. And so no matter what they do or what they say or however much they try and trigger us with surveys like this, it doesn't really matter because they're already a dead man walking. And so I think that the conversation that we should have, and I still want to have another few kicks at them before we finish this call, but I think the conversation we should be really thinking about as an industry is how we're going to thrive in a post-Google future. How are we going to manage the distribution and the discovery and the monetization of our content when we don't have Google anymore? Because I just don't think Google that we have today is going to be the Google that we're going to have in 3 to 5 years from now.
And interestingly, having kind of taken their penance and gone off, and sort of reformed the company, the biggest beneficiary of the breakup of Chrome is probably going to be Bing. So it's probably going to be Microsoft, which is sort of interesting.
Look, I'm going to do a bit of a, I don't know, what would you call it? I'm going to give you an insight into what I'm working on already. So I have a 21 chapter business case about why the news industry should buy Chrome. And everybody says to me, that's ridiculous. Media companies can't pay $20 billion for Chrome. And my response is, number one, yes, they can. They have $20 billion if they want collectively. The second thing, though, is that it's not going to go for $20 billion. It's going to go for $1 to somebody to save them in the same way as TikTok, right? And so if you're the US government and you're trying to find a way out of the dilemma that you've got yourself in, which is A, we have to kill Google, and B, we have to get rid of Chrome, and C, we can't give it to any other tech company or we just bolster their monopoly. Who do you give it to, right? Jeff from Wisconsin? No, of course you don't. You have to find someone else, right? And the answer is that it's probably going to be somebody just like the news industry. So I actually think that, as we prepare for a post-Google world, the actual answer is that we don't work without Google. We are Google. And I think that would be just so poetic, given the week that we've just had.
Do you think in that negotiation we turn up and say, well, we've done a study and we think the valuation of the browser traffic
of Google
is zero?
Is $1.
It's zero.
No, I'm going to be generous. I'm going to say it's $1. I'm willing to throw over $1, to make it happen. All right, so look, I'm not done with my rage. You're not allowed to steal my rage because all week I've been bottling this up and I haven't been talking about it. And people have been ringing me and I've not been taking their calls. And I want to be scientific about my anger because if you shout, it's like throwing mud at a wall. It just leaves it messy. I don't want to do that, right? I want to throw a cricket ball directly between the eyes. I want to get it perfect. So I've been doing research, all right? So here you go. You're right. 13,409 different news brands were switched off by Google to make its argument that there was no value to news. Now, we live in very interesting times. So if you want to have a look at how many news brands were shut down by Google, 13,409, and then compare it to other times in history when news has been silenced by totalitarian regimes, there are 3 or 4 in recent history that people would point to. Now, I can go all the way back to Napoleon if you want, because I've reported on that previously, but I'm not. I'm going to start with the Second World War. So during the Second World War, the Nazi Party shut down publications in Germany that were anti the Nazi Party, and they also shut down all the publications in all the countries that they went to, to ensure that there was no alternative opinion being offered. And so I wanted to know how many there were. And so I could have gone and done the research, and I did. And I looked up and down, and I went to look for a number. No one could find me a real number. So I thought the sensible thing to do would be to go and ask Google Gemini, right? because Google Gemini is apparently genius, because Google's a genius, because Paul Liu tells me apparently he's a genius. He should know the answer to this. But the answer was it couldn't come back with an actual answer. But it came back and it said that the answer is probably in the high hundreds, maybe 1,000. Okay, so let's just go back to Google's number again. It just silenced, in the flick of a switch, 13,409 news brands.
Yeah.
And the Nazi Party managed to pull off 1,000. That's interesting. So I then decided to go and have a look how many have been turned off in China. Hundreds, not thousands, hundreds. And then Russia, hundreds, not thousands. And so what we've got, here you go, this is what Gemini said. Well, I can't give you an exact number. It's very safe to say that the number of shuttered publications by the Nazis is high and perhaps in the high hundreds. Yeah. So news outlets silenced by, let's remember, an illegal monopoly, okay, that's facing an imminent breakup and further prosecution for deleting tens of millions of messages and pages of evidence, silenced 13,000 publishers and half of Europe to try and avoid a law being brought by elected governments. What am I getting wrong here, Chris? What am I missing here?
I would say it's an incredible flex of the power, isn't it? So we know that from the study that 97% of traffic was suppressed for those sites, for the 1% of people that were in it. So, they will say there's only 1% of customers, 1% of the group that was in here, but 97% of traffic disappeared. And if 97% of traffic from a 90+% monopoly disappears, you are silencing those. In terms of a flex of sort of saying, look, if we want to kind of de-index organizations, it's 97% of pain for them, is the reason why, for example, publishers are getting drawn into allowing Google to have AI overviews, which is another case that's now got picked up by the EU to say you can't do this, basically. But that's the reason that you and I know that publishers for years have been kind of gradually, as Matthew's point says, like gradually moving from mission A to mission B. And at each point, it's become more and more difficult to extricate themselves from it, which is why we find ourselves in the position we are. The level to which any company, sorry, I'll go off on my own rant now, but one of the things that when we talk about the copyright debate, which is a separate conversation, but when we talk about the copyright debate, one of the things that drives me crazy is there's a conversation about we need to run this race for AI for national security reasons. And on the way to do that, we're prepared to destroy the kind of publishing industry and the information landscape. And there's no concept that that is a national security issue. And it's the same conversation that we're having here. We're saying that there's no, quote, in quotes, there's no value to trusted information from an ad revenue perspective. But do we not believe that if we're going to have, interstitial kind of machines sat between the public and their information, that there should be some kind of provision of trusted information that's baked into those contracts? Because otherwise, what does that lead us to?
You see my eyes narrowing.
I know.
But
I'm worried about the Tassie whiskey.
Oh, it's not the whiskey, right? This is 35 years of exposing powerful people that try to silence the truth. Yeah. And Google is, without doubt, the most insidious example of that I've come across in everything I've ever done in my career. Okay. So a couple of things here, right? If you try to ascertain the value of information based on how many ads it delivers, what kind of a nonsense is that? Like the very first thing you're taught when you come out of school is that the best things in life are free, right? But they're not to Google. Google's happy to just snap those off, right? If it doesn't deliver a CPM for Google, right? So liberty. What's the CPM on liberty today? Hang on, let me check. I'll get Paul Liu to find out for me. Paul, tell me how the liberty is going today. What? How much?
Yeah.
Oh, no money. Oh, let's just get rid of that. Like, shut down liberty. We don't want that anymore. What about? Hang on, Paul. Love, mate. How's that? Shut it. No, don't shut it off. Like seriously. Like not everything in the world comes with a price tag. Okay, I know that they're a listed company, but there are more important things, right? And so when I'm trying to think about, all right, well, what is the actual value of the thing that news does, right, it isn't measured in 0.7% of Google's traffic. I don't give a fuck about Google's traffic.
But
I care an awful lot about the news.
yeah, but then don't you get to the argument though? So right, you get to the argument at that point though that if almost total control of information distribution is going to be given to a private company, this is almost always where it ends up. And this is going to be the conversation that sort of turns it on the AI side too, right? You've seen at some point a lot of the AI companies are going to think, well, hang on a minute, I don't really have a mass market business model because people aren't going to pay 20. Your average guy in the street, who was your guy, your Jeff from Wisconsin, is not going to pay $20,000 to have an open AI agent in his basement. And the model that is going to open that up is going to be advertising. And advertising revenue is a perfectly valid way of making money, but it drives, a certain behavior. And if you're creating information or you're writing content or you're acting in everything that you do to drive advertising revenue, that is for a set of customers that are your advertisers and their customers. That is not
Yes.
what you would do to say, okay, liberty, love, all of those kind
Art,
of things. That
I don't know, throw
all
it
of that,
music.
yeah, that isn't driven by the same things that drive ad revenue. And one of the challenges of an algorithmic world is algorithms is they have to be pointed somewhere. And if you say I'm pointing you at ad revenue, you get a set of behaviors. If you say I'm pointing you at trusted information, you get a set of behaviors. So I think there is a long-term question for as we're sort of revisiting, starting to break things up and move around. I'm not sure the answer is necessarily that you just basically you give the same kind of monopoly to a different private company. That would be a disaster. There's an argument that a properly competitive market drives the right behaviors. I think there's a bit of time to be spent there to say, well, what would have to be in place to make that the case?
Yeah, I think we should. Let's come to that at the end because my I've spoken about this on here
Yeah.
before. Is that I think the internet's going to fracture. I think we're going to end up with national internets. I think we're going to end up with the splinternet. I think it's going to be an
Mm.
uncomfortable period, and it's not going to be great. But we are going to end up with national interests like that. The reason that Google didn't include France and Germany in this is because France is intending to send them to jail, and Google's a massive market where they make most of their money in
Yeah.
Europe. That's why they didn't
Yeah.
touch them. They went for all the weak ones, right? I was in a
Mm.
meeting once. I don't know if I'm sure I've told you this, and I'm going to say it now on the record. I was on a call with the French Competition Commission. Did I tell you this? And then they said to me, yeah, we did, didn't we?
Yeah.
And they basically said, oh look, we're going to deal with Google, for their anti-competitive behavior. And somebody in the room said, what about Meta? And they just said, oh, that's a criminal matter. I'm like, okay, so we'll see how that goes. But look, I just want to close out this story about the value of information, right? Because Google
Mm.
measures everything in dots, in ones and zeros, and dollars. Okay, and that's its job. And we, to some extent, have to, as the public, we have to accept that we created these financial incentives, and we taught that company to behave like that. And the
Yep.
whole system is that that's what they should do because they're shareholder first. And that has ultimately created a situation that's put the public last. And so we shouldn't really be outraged when we taught them to do that. And that's what they then did. They're doing their job incredibly well. That's why they're one of the most powerful and profitable
Yeah.
companies in the world. The problem is that eventually you reach a point where that's so damaging for the public at large that you have to stop it, right? And that's why
Yeah.
it's being broken up. But it's funny. I don't know if you're aware, but Tuesday was the anniversary of Cambridge Analytica. And so, that was the story that revealed that Meta had, given its data to a company that enabled it to affect elections. And we've also got the biggest stories in the world. I tried to try and imagine what they were. I wrote some down: the Panama Papers, Watergate, the invasion
Mm.
of Ukraine. All of these things are being measured by Google as a CPM, but they're not measured as a CPM. They're measured as
Yeah.
humanity, which is something else. Have you ever tried trying to explain what a CPM is to the children that are starving in sub-Saharan Africa, right? They don't get any shits. And I just think that we're failing in our job as journalists to be able to report this information if we rely on a company that gives no care at all to that. We're on the wrong platform.
Yeah. I'm not, as you know, I'm not a Google defense lawyer, but I would say so that they would argue, well, Google News, there's no ads in Google News, and we provide Google News as a service for people. We provide kind of Discover as a personalization service. Given there's no value of this kind of stuff, that's a give from us. Um, I don't, I still think ultimately, even the design of kind of all of the Google, but ultimately it's still measured in ad revenue. And kind of this study sort of shows that when they think of the value of something, it
Well,
is
that's what they
almost
talked
always
about.
tracked back
That
to
is
that.
exactly what it was.
Yeah.
It was tracked back specifically to dollars. It wasn't the
Yeah.
value of the service. It was back to how much money does it make us.
Yeah.
So it's not serving the customer or the public. It's
So
serving the
striking.
shareholders.
If you come back to in the UK, you look at something like I'm not designing the future, but if you look at something like PSB broadcasters, these are public service broadcasters,
Yeah.
BBC, ITV, Channel 4, whatever. There's a few kind of parts of what the government regulates in TV in the UK that says, for example, if you're a PSB provider, you must get kind of preferential display on TVs. So
Yeah.
when you go to your TV, the BBC will be there, ITV will be there.
It's kind of the must-carry terminology, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what we're basically saying is in TV broadcasting, we appreciate that there's a commercial market. We appreciate that a lot of those companies make their money. So Channel 4 is a PSB, but it makes its money in advertising. We appreciate there's this kind of ad revenue driving function of those things, but we have put in place some guardrails that say, we want to make sure that this kind of information is provided and the programming that benefits the public good is provided. And that to me is what is slightly lacking in the landscape that we've got at the moment. We've essentially said we think that the profit motive of private companies, matched with consumer appetites, will effectively get us to a sound kind of information footing. And we're reaching, I think, the end of that experiment and finding that it really doesn't.
Oh yes, we are, and we need a new one. All right. So the last thing before we get to that. So I said to you that, I've bottled up all my rage all week. I haven't touched a drop of whiskey until tonight. And I've been saving it all up to now to try and explain where I think that Google comes unstuck with this strategy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's here. So I've talked about three things, really, three key messages in my feedback on this. The first one is that Google thinks about profits over people. Okay, and so therefore its motive is very, very clear. It's going to do whatever drives the most money possible. That's the first thing. There's a fact that I wrote in my newsletter a couple of weeks ago that didn't get enough take up, but I'll mention it again now, which is that sometime in late October, Google earned more money outside America than in it for the first time in its history. And it's now the last one. Apple, Microsoft, Meta, and Amazon all earn more money outside America than in it. And the only one that still made more was Google. And now Google's in that group as well. So all of those companies, if shareholders come first, America comes second. I'll just drop that. Okay. So I think that that's now a big issue. But what we've also just learned, and this is really kind of my takeaway from this, my punchline on this, my mic drop, is that Google has just shown it can silence publishers in the flip of a switch. Now, 297 million people use Google, okay? And 57 million people elected Donald Trump in America, which basically means that Google speaks to 5 times as many people as the White House, as the president. And so if Google decided to go for election, it would win. Or if Google decided to choose someone to be the president, Google would win. Google would achieve that. What Google's done by turning off all these newspapers is proven that it can turn off a government or a nation state. Yeah. Now think about what the implications of that are for democracy. Okay, great. We're probably slightly left leaning. So we're just all soft, right? But imagine that you are not left-leaning and you are actually a really aggressive leader. You have somebody in your country that you technically control that has more power than you, right? I think that by turning off these newspapers, I think that Google has just reminded the White House that it is more powerful than the White House is. And I don't think that that message has been missed. I think that
It's
the White House might decide that breaking up Google is a good idea because it certainly doesn't want to have that, especially given that Google itself has shown it's quite left-leaning already. I think the White House is going to be quite aggressive about it.
yeah. I mean, don't categorize me as left leaning, by the way. But I do think I hope the UK is listening because the UK is. I hope the UK has looked at this study and thought about what it means because it is in trade negotiations with the US. It's going to give up the digital service tax, which means it will basically not tax the profits of Google in the UK in the same way that it has. It's going to be asked to give up all regulatory kind of oversight and to harmonise with the US regulatory system in order not to be taking massive tariffs on its car industry. And that is I think the extent to which we're talking about a kind of call it a sort of expansionist American view of how media should be treated, and that being kind of canonized in trade discussions with individual countries across the world. That's something that I think I'm really not comfortable that is a good thing for the UK. And to go back to the point you made about the sort of splinternet question, the UK is, I've said this before, UK is in quite a strange position. I'm going to sneeze. There you go.
There you
go. Thank you very
much. You're welcome.
The UK is in a strange position because it is sort of bridging between. You see this all the time in UK kind of diplomacy at the moment. It bridges between the US and the EU. It's got a foot in both camps, and it can never quite kind of commit to either. But where the EU is headed in terms of kind of regulation of the information kind of world, and where the US is heading, are two very different destinations.
Yeah.
So the UK has got
100%.
a foot on both roller skates, and gradually they're kind of diverging. And that,
I love that. Which way do you think it goes?
Well, it looks like so. From what I've heard, it looks like the UK.
So you told me that the UK is the third largest AI company in the world. You told me last week.
Yeah. The third biggest sort of AI superpower. Yeah. So I think that is, at the moment, that's a very seductive prize. The UK wants to move to be a more high tech kind of economy, so I think that's going to be on the table. But that's where, from what we're hearing, there is kind of a pushback on things like the Online Safety Act, because I think Keir Starmer particularly is a believer that you shouldn't be able to harm children. I mean, it doesn't sound like a crazy kind of negotiating position to take, but
what on earth? I mean, that's going to impact the CPM, right? I need to deal with that. Paul,
but yeah,
children.
Yeah, but I think there is going to be kind of a strong debate there, and but I'm just not sure. I'm not sure where it's going to come out. But the fact that it's even on the table is something that I think, as you say, nation states all over the world should be just sort of slightly scratching their heads and say, are we? One of the things that most nation states have protected is their ability to have a free and fair media, in their own territories, and that's the battle, I think, for how this all shakes out.
Is that? Oh no, it's not new. That's 2,000 years old. But yes, I agree with you.
Yeah.
And so I saw something interesting happen not very long ago. You and I had a chat about it. America decided it didn't like TikTok and it switched it off.
Yeah.
And TikTok went dark. Do you remember?
Yeah.
What happens if Google decides it doesn't like this US government and decides that is going to have to go dark as well? Yeah, who's going to win in that fight? I was listening to a Bloomberg presentation. It was somebody who was being in. I was in my office. It was a long time ago. It was about 2019. It was before COVID, and I was sitting in my office and I'm typing, and Matt was there. And I've got Bloomberg running up here in the corner, and I'm chatting away. I'm doing my thing, and I'm not really paying attention. There's a bloke on TV up here, and they're talking about Meta coming under attack from the US government. It was the very, very first discussions of antitrust in 2019. And the interviewer is at the end of her interview. She's getting a bit bored. She's shuffling her papers and looking at what she's going to be doing next. And she says something like, she just says, so, if you were Meta, what would you do? What would you do to deal with this? And it's only like an offhand question. And the guy, I wish I knew who he was. We should have him on. I'll try and find him. Yeah. He basically says, well, the only way that Meta protects itself from a government is by investing its money in nuclear weapons. And I was like, Can I just say that? Like, and the irony is that here we are, like a couple of years later, and Google has the ability to silence a government, and a government is happy to go nuclear on them to stop them being able to do
Yeah.
it, right? So, all right, let's bring it back to what we care about, right? Because at the end of the day, right, Google is in its end of days. This is a death rattle. It's look, I honestly, I've spent so much time working on this stuff. So many people have told me I'm an idiot and I'm wrong, but I've been right more often than I've been wrong. And I just think Google's days are numbered for a whole host of reasons. We talked about a whole load of them today, but ultimately, politicians on both sides of the aisle want Google broken up for different reasons. On the left-leaning side of the aisle, on the Biden's watch, they wanted it broken up because they wanted to create and foster new competition and innovation. And on the Trump side of the government, they want to change it because they know it has too loud a voice and they want to break it into bite-sized chunks that they can manage. And so either way, Google goes, okay? And so Google's going to go. So the question I've got for you, and it's an absolutely great one, I'm going to drop the mic and go to the pub next door, right, is this. If you're the publishing industry and you rely today for 90% of your traffic on Google, and Google might just snap off sometime fairly soon, when do you start to pivot, and what do you pivot to?
It's a great question. So one of the things I was when I was looking at this study is I was thinking, I wish, and I know it didn't happen, but I wish that 1% test sample could have been shared with the news industry so they could see whether people basically found the brands that they wanted to find. So we never saw what happened in the kind of behavior of customers who actually wanted to get to that news, whether they did or not. I think
we should put a call out here to those publishers that did get shut off, and just say to them, did you see your traffic decline in the way that Google says? And did you see your referral traffic from other platforms increase?
Yeah, and the beauty of the way that study was designed is what they're all going to say is Christ knows, because Trump happened and it was Christmas.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. They chose perfect timing for it, right? No, that was
so we don't know
the
that.
point. No one was going to come.
I think publishers are planning for this already. I think at the moment, because the Google the Google cases haven't quite it's not exactly clear what's going to happen. I think they're planning for it, but I actually think it's interesting that so many publishers I talk to, I mean, anybody who's probably, what would you have to be, under the age of 40, you've never actually operated as a publisher in a world where there was a fair fight in search. It's never been a planning assumption that you could make. That
Are you telling them that there was a world before Google?
yeah, unfortunately, as the village elder, you're saying, But if you imagine, they're more and more starting to think to have to scenario plan for what if there was a genuine competitive market in distribution. How would you be able as publishers to collectively kind of king make, in a non-anti-competitive fashion, but to basically work with the browsers that you felt represented the interests of the news industry the best? Now, to do that, you need a choice of 5 or 6, and you need to show that basically there are winners. You need to show that consumers will vote for their feet. All of that is possible. And more, I'm talking to publishers who are starting to think through, well, then you're going to have a strong owned and operated product. You're going to have a different approach to marketing. You're going to have
like Google Chrome that's coming up for sale, for example.
I'll chuck my 50 cents into your dollar. Yeah.
Yeah, all right, I'll go halves with you. Look, as far as I can tell, Google Chrome delivered, hang on, I've got the numbers on the wall here. So Google Chrome delivered $289 billion. So it's a dollar well invested. And you need to know that shareholders come first. So people forget about them, but the shareholders come first. Do you genuinely think that publishers are actually thinking about this future? Because I worry that they are just standing like deer in the middle of the motorway, looking at the headlights, waiting for the oncoming.
Weirdly, yes, I
truck.
do. I think
really.
I think, I do because I think that if you work sort of in those businesses, right, you're always working on a kind of rolling 12-month, 18-month plan, and you're always kind of thinking about, okay, if this, I can see the trends in all of these different parts of the business, and I kind of can, okay, I can take a bit of cost out here, I can fire a few journalists over there, I can I'm coming to the end of one of my rental contracts, I can shut a building down, and
that's worked really well for the last 25 years.
So you're trying to do that, and I think when I'm talking to people, let's say when I'm talking to people off the record, they're starting to say that 12 to 18 month plan is starting to creak very badly. And AI and the AI overview world, I think people can see that's going to accelerate it because it's another drop in traffic, it's another competitor for inventory and ad revenue and yield. So I think there is this kind of realization, and the third thing that's going into that is people can mostly see the end of print now. So you've
Yeah.
kind of got those three things together.
Yeah. Is this the point? Is this the point where you just say, as hard as it is, we're going to shut down chopping trees for paper?
Yeah, yeah.
We're there.
I mean, we're there in 5-year, 10-year planning scenarios. Yeah, definitely.
10
No,
years? I
no.
haven't
What I'm
bought.
saying is
I
when you're
love paper. I haven't bought a newspaper in a decade.
no. So there's a big between that 5 and 10 year period. You know, there's just a decimation. So most
Yeah.
people now are seeing that come through in the sort of medium term planning, and that does create it. I think if you think about the kind of it takes a lot of courage to make these sort of really big leaps, and there's a kind of courage that comes from knowing that if you just sit where you are, you know, you're going to die. And I hear that a little more in the conversations that I'm having with publishers than I did 12 months ago.
Can I ask you this then, which is a tough question, and we've talked about this a little bit. Do we have the leaders who are capable of making those decisions? Because most of the leaders I know are exhausted and are at the end of their tether, and they're not digital native, and they certainly don't know how AI works. Do we believe that we have the leadership required at this point?
I think the people that own the news industry have proven they can cycle talent in and out of those businesses when they need to. Put it that way.
It's a very political way of putting it. All right. So look, I want to say thank you very much indeed for Paul Liu at Google for not you, Paul Liu at Google for giving us so much to think about this week. It's been absolutely sensational, and I'm sure he's going to enjoy his new job at 7-Eleven when Google's broken up, and that's absolutely super. So that's me personally to you, Paul. Just so you know, you can find me on LinkedIn. And look, at the end of the day, right? I genuinely believe this to be true. That throughout all of the eras, there have been monopolies, there's been governments, there's been changes, there's been technologies, there's been wars, there's been famine. But people's need for information has always been perpetual. And from the first time a person asked a question to the very last thing a person will ask when humanity as a species ends. Google is a flash in the pan. It's had a great 25 years. It's done a brilliant job, but Google is ending. And let's not get mad and angry about them desperately trying to stay alive for the last 15 minutes of fame. Okay, I can remember when like Dolly Parton did the same thing, right? Who gives a shit? They're moving on, but we need to start to think about what we do on the other side of this when their mountain just disappears and crumbles to dust. And that's okay. But that's what we really, really ought to be putting our energies to. And so it's been great while it lasted, but now it's just toxic and wrong and ugly and not right. And it's a bit like NSYNC when they try and get together on stage again, right? It's just not the same as it used to be. The magic ain't there. So let's prepare for a new future. What do you reckon? Oh, actually, you were telling me. What was your karaoke? What was your karaoke go-to? Remind me.
I said it was Rolling on a River, but the Icontina version, and I could sing both parts.
You can do it, right? Because you see, the thing is, when I've had 47 beers, I have to get into Green Day. I'm all over Green Day. Absolutely love it. We'll do this when because I think there's a possibility, everybody, just so you know, there's just a tiny possibility, we're negotiating at the moment, that Chris and I might be going on a world tour.
Karaoke in a place near you. Thanks to everyone.
Well, it's not karaoke, is it? Right? We're maybe going on tour to speak at a series of world events, which is going to be very, very cool, and doing this live on stage. But anyway, look, thanks everybody for joining again. Chris, thanks, mate. Did we miss anything?
No, I think we got it all. And can I just say that it was only you that slagged Dolly Parton?
No, I think she's fantastic. I'm just saying that perhaps she isn't quite as light on her feet as she used to be back in the day. Everybody, thanks so much for coming along. And look, we'll be back again, same time next week, live. Don't know what the topic's going to be. We make it up as we go along. And we will see you then. Thanks, everybody.
See ya.
See ya.